Okay, so I am here today to talk to you about the state's counterplan. I know that you all have already heard a little bit about the state's counterplan in a variety of other lectures, including sort of the topic lecture that kicked off our whole camp experience. So I'm excited to go a little bit more in depth about this and to hopefully clear up some questions that many of you may still have about the state's counterplan. If you have questions throughout, I will pause at a variety of points in time and sort of try and ask about particular things. And then hopefully there will be some time for questioning at the end. But just to give you a brief overview of what I am going to talk about in this lecture, first I'm going to start with some of the distinctions between the federal government and the state governments, particularly in terms of how they spend money and how they are allowed to spend money and how they are allowed to get money to begin with. Then I'm going to focus some time on the theory debate itself and how you might be able to win either that the state's counterplan is a good or a bad test of the affirmative on this year's topic. And then finally, I will talk about the state's counterplan a little bit more specifically against each area. If I have time at the end, I will talk about sort of like different types of the state's counterplan and different ways that people change the state's counterplan to make it slightly more innovative and slightly more difficult to answer. But first, I want to start with a game. As far as I'm concerned, if you all are such advocates for state action, you should probably be able to identify states. So we're going to start with a quick game that I call "What State Is This?" Okay, all right. What state is this? Oh, we're pretty good. All right, what state is this? All right. So, I heard a lot of Montanas. I heard a lot of Wyomings. This is not a state. It is a square that was drawn in Microsoft Paint. Okay? So, we clearly have some work to do before we are ready to debate the state's counterplan on this year's topic. Although, I sort of like the way that this square embodies the way that most of you go for the state's counterplan, because it turns out that by the time you all are done manipulating what the states are actually capable of doing, it has become an amorphous blob that no longer represents any of the individual 50 states or all of them together, but rather an entity that looks a little bit more like the federal government. So I'm going to start today by talking about taxing authority and different types of taxes that you might have heard on this topic and whether or not those taxes are currently levied by states or the federal government, okay? And I use the word currently for a reason, okay? Because taxing is what is called a concurrent power, which means that both the federal government and the state governments have the ability to levy taxes. And there really isn't too much of a distinction between the types of taxes that the states and the federal government can, in fact, levy. If the state government wanted to change its sort of like method of taxation, it would be able to do so in much the same way that the federal government can. However, in the status quo, states and the federal government lean on sort of different taxes in order to generate the revenue that they generate. So I want to talk about that really briefly. And I'm going to elicit from you all some of these types of taxes, okay? And when you raise your hand and tell me a type of tax, I'm just going to go ahead and tell you ahead of time. The ones that I've included on this slide are alphabetized, okay? So, if you start with one, I might say, yeah, that one's going to come up later, all right? But somebody give me a type of tax. Yes, in the center. A carbon tax. Is that levied by anyone right now? Not really. So I actually did not include it on my slide. But if we want to talk about carbon taxing either by the state or the federal government, I will be happy to answer questions about it later because I think that it is an interesting example of a distinction between a potential distinction between federal and state taxation authority. In the back. An income tax. That is the third one that I have on here alphabetically. Do you know who does income taxes? Just the federal government? It's mostly both. There are 43 states that have an income tax. 7 states do not have an income tax. Yes? An estate tax. Number one that I have up here. Oh no, I maybe popped it up early. An estate tax, okay? Estate taxes are currently used by the federal government. The states use, well, some states use something that is slightly different. But estate taxes are really like, in order for you to to have estate taxation administered upon your inheritance of estate, the estate itself has to be worth more than $12 million. So there's not very many people that are subject to estate taxes, but they are levied by the federal government. Any other ideas? Yes?
Excise taxes.
Okay, a sin tax or an excise tax. These are sometimes levied by the states, sometimes levied by the federal government, usually levied by states. And in fact, there's a pretty popular excise tax that people will use in order to generate revenue for the state's counterplan. Do any of you know what that example might be? Yes, taxing marijuana. That is a relatively normal plank to have on the state's counterplan that would count as an excise tax. I think that income is next. We've already talked about an income tax at least a little bit. A few other things that I want to say about an income tax in case you don't know. We've already talked a little bit during these lectures about how the federal income tax has a progressive tax bracket, right? People who make more money have more income taxes taken by the federal government. Not all states have a progressive system for their state income tax. There are a few states that actually use a flat tax mechanism where everyone gets taxed the same amount by the state on their income. But most states also use a progressive income tax. Okay, what else do we have? I've been calling on people in the middle a lot, so yes. A sales tax. That's sort of toward the bottom, but yes, it's a good one. Who levies sales taxes? States. States levy sales taxes, and not all states have sales taxes either. Property taxes. That is another good example. Who levies property taxes? Technically, it's like municipalities usually, and a little bit more of like local areas, but yeah, they fall under the auspices of non-federal taxes. Yes? Payroll taxes? I think that might be next. Oh no, an inheritance tax is next. Most states don't have inheritance taxes. They've sort of like gotten rid of them. It turns out that when you are trying to tax someone's inheritance, one, it usually means that they have an inheritance, which also usually means that they can, litigate a lot of the process of that inheritance tax. And two, it also sort of like, there are a lot of economists that believe that inheritance taxes discourage people saving money. So a lot of people have started moving away from inheritance taxes just sort of as a general rule. Property taxes, as we've already mentioned, are mostly levied by states and municipalities. Sales taxes. And then the last one that I have on here is kind of popular in other places. They're called value-added taxes. The United States does not have a value-added tax at this current juncture, but it is certainly something that could be levied and then used in order to fund different mechanisms on this particular topic, okay? So many of you have already explored the next thing that I want to talk about, which is when someone is taxed, how are those taxes collected? So we're going to talk about why this really matters, okay? So taxes are enforced by a taxing authority. Who is the federal taxing authority that we already have a disadvantage about? The IRS. Very good, okay? So for the federal government, the IRS is in charge of our sort of like taxing authority. So who collects state taxes? The states. Yes, very good. Okay? The states do. The states have their own independent taxing authority, okay? And if you think that the IRS is overstretched and has problems, implementing its tax policies, and would have a hard time enforcing the plan effectively, imagine how bad the states are. In fact, as I sort of prepared this rant, I started Googling some examples and found out that less than a month ago, in the very state in which I live, we forgot to collect 3 months worth of taxes. This article is from May 31st, 2023. So if you think that there are not solvency deficits to be made about the state's ability to administer all of the taxes that you are just going to fiat into existence, then you are probably, not necessarily on the right side of truth. Now, I know that most of you think when you read a counterplan that money is infinite and you can just solve all of the problems with the state taxing authorities by just giving them more money. But as we will discuss now, they probably can't even get all of that money, okay? So this graph that I've chosen to show you on this particular page is a very simplified version of what I think should be a very powerful and successful affirmative argument against the state's counterplan, which is, quite frankly, we are discussing a topic on income inequality, and income inequality in the United States is not equal. There are states that do not make as much money as other states. So this graph is a simplified version of the fact that some states literally pay the federal government more in taxes than they receive in tax benefits from the federal government, whereas other states are actually receiving more money in the status quo from the federal government than they are actually able to generate in taxes. What does that indicate? Seems to be an issue with funding anything through the states. Have any of you looked into disparities in wealth between states? No, because we can just fiat those away, right? Well, I mean, not really, okay? The median income in a state this isn't a state, but it's part of your counterplan because you usually say relevant territories, etc. The per capita income in Washington, D.C. is $60,000 per person. Okay, what does per capita income mean? Somebody raise their hand if they think they know what per capita is. Yes? Jude, yeah. Per person. The income per person. What affirmative, or set of affirmatives, but probably just one affirmative on this topic, might be concerned with how much money is given per person? Okay, a basic income, right? The per capita income in Washington, D.C. is the highest of any state or municipality according to the most recent census, and it's about $59,000 per person, okay? So in Washington, D.C., the richest state, if you took all of the income that someone made in a year and you split it up, you would have to distribute 20% of everyone's wealth in order to fund $1,000 a month. Right? 12 over 60, 1 over 5, 20%. Yes? What do you think it is in the poorest state? It is $24,000 per capita in Mississippi. So we are talking about your millionaire tax or whatever you do to fund the plan needing to take literally half of the wealth of the state of Mississippi from each person and distribute it evenly among them each year. Well, it might be, it definitely would be a disaster for Mississippi, right? Like, there is nowhere in our country that we have ever taxed in such a way that the state itself would have to redistribute half of its money. And that's not to mention some of the territories. Guam, American Samoa, and another territory that I can't think of off the top of my head are all under 12,000 per capita income. They literally couldn't fund it. Okay? Like, to say that we can just fiat all of this money into existence is a gross overstatement of what the states can actually do. Now, there are ways that you can sort of solve this. You could try and increase the revenue that's going to the states in some way. So an example of that is, perhaps you could increase tolls. And then people who are driving across Mississippi would have to pay tolls, and Mississippi would increase the amount of money that they received beyond the capacity of the state to actually fund the Counterplan. But most likely, you're not going to be able to increase tolls enough to make up for the fact that the per capita income in Mississippi is $24,000 per person. Okay, you could legalize weed, but unless people spend half of their income on weed in Mississippi, they are probably not going to generate enough tax revenue in order to fund the AF, okay? So, like, to say that we can just fiat into existence solvency for the state's counterplan is perhaps a little bit of an overstretch of what we can do. Now, I'm going to make some suggestions later about how you can cheat, and then hopefully make suggestions for the AF about how the neg can lose. But, we'll see if we can get there, okay? So you might be asking yourself, well, if the states are in such a budget pinch, why can't they just deficit spend, right? Like, we've been having all these discussions throughout camp about how maybe the affirmative can deficit spend. Why can't the state's counterplan just deficit spend? It is unconstitutional in the vast majority of the states. In fact, states have what are called balanced budget requirements, okay? And a balanced budget requirement means that unlike the federal government, when the states pass their yearly fiscal budget, they are responsible for showing how they are going to pay for that money, for that spending via taxation, okay? So it basically requires that the revenue in each state that is brought in offset the spending that the state plans to do. Now, I have given you a map over here that shows you that this is not exactly perfect, okay? Shown in blue are all of the states that are running a budget surplus, i.e., they are taking in a little bit more money than they are spending. And shown in red over a 15-year period are the 9 states that failed to meet their goal of taking in as much money as they were planning to spend. Now, we'll talk about what happens there here in a second because, it is a little bit confusing. What do you all notice about the bottom left-hand corner of this particular map? Alaska is so blue that it appears to be black on the image because it made 137% of its yearly revenue over that 14 or 15-year period. It was 35% over what it needed to be. That is relatively important. Yeah. Yes, 100%. Yeah, you're good.
Is Ian shown here or anyone who has seen Ian shown this morning? If Ian shown is your roommate, please come down here.
Proud lab leader. Okay. So this also sort of explains how Alaska has been able to do what Alaska has been able to do, which is be the first state that has something approaching a basic income, right? Alaska is taking in much, much, much more revenue than they are spending, which is a conscious choice that Alaska has made. And they also have some other structural advantages, like a lot of oil, okay? Now, proof of the negative argument is that Vermont does not have a balanced budget requirement. So would it be possible for the negative to just add a plank to their counterplan that would allow states to remove their balanced budget requirements and deficit spend in order to make up the revenue that is not capable of being, collected via taxation? Probably. Okay? Like, those cards exist. You could just add a plank. Here's the problem with adding a plank. Everyone agrees that this, well, I shouldn't say everyone. Most people agree that this would be a disaster. And we will talk about why a little bit here in a second. But when we've talked about things like economics and debt so far at camp, a lot of the things, including, Bunton's discussion of modern monetary theory, have to do with the balance between the GDP and debt. Okay? And it turns out that for a country like the United States, whose GDP is very large, that balance is a little bit easier to strike than each individual state. So removing the sort of deficit spending limit and allowing states to deficit spend would very likely cause some pretty huge ripple effects within those states, because it would very quickly allow them to exceed a advisable debt to GDP ratio. Okay, so that's what I do have sound. That's what I want to talk about here. Okay, so sometimes things happen, and sometimes states need things. Okay, so if we went back to the last slide, which I won't because I don't want to startle you awake again, but if I went back to the last slide, there are 9 states that did not take in as much money, right? Doesn't that violate their constitution? Well, I guess kind of, right? States can borrow money. They are allowed to borrow money. They can borrow money from the federal government, or they can borrow money from investors, or they can borrow money for their basic operations, okay? Most borrowed money that the states can do are for emergency spending on things like infrastructure, elderly care, or education. Different states sort of have different requirements in their state constitutions about what they are allowed to borrow money for. Some states it's just infrastructure. Some states are a little bit more expansive in terms of what they can borrow money for. But states are allowed to borrow money. And allowing state borrowing will almost, or more state borrowing, or increasing state borrowing, will almost certainly be planks that people will add to their counterplans. Okay? The money that states borrow is almost entirely in the form of bonds. Okay? Most of the bonds that states borrow are long-term bonds, which means that they have a lot of time to increase their revenue streams and pay back their borrowed money. But some states, particularly those who normally run a large budget surplus, will borrow short-term bonds, which just allows them to pay them back over the course of the next fiscal year. Some states just don't allow that at all. Most of the bonds that are held, I think 47%, so not most, but a plurality of the bonds that are held by households. So just citizens hold the bonds on state government debt. Okay? Now, I have the graph that I have here because the limit to state deficit spending usually exists within each state. Okay? So some states will literally cap the amount of debt that they are allowed to accrue based on the GDP within the state. Okay? So in order to increase borrowing, states would probably also have to get rid of this cap and make it to where they can borrow sort of like as much money as they might need to do the plan. There are a lot of authors, if you are trying to answer the state's counterplan, who also say that this would be catastrophic. because it would allow states to accrue more debt than they could possibly pay back. And like we've talked about in other lectures, a lot of our ability to stabilize our currency in a world where we do something like massively deficit spend is based on the fact that people believe that we can pay it back, right? Like the capacity for output in the United States economy is massive, and it is so large that many investors, both domestic and abroad, believe that the United States can pay back the debts that it has accumulated based on its economic output. Many investors are less confident in Mississippi. I sort of feel bad for Mississippi in this lecture. I'm sorry. But, you know, it's just math. Yeah. So, other funding sources. Okay? So the last thing that I want to talk about are the other places that states get their money. So as you can see from this graph, there are two main sort of areas that states get their money besides taxes. Okay? The first one that they can generate internally are what this graph calls charges. The third column over there says charges and miscellaneous. It currently makes up about 19% of all of state revenue that comes in. Charges come from things like tuition. Tuition to state universities will go back to the state. Tolls, and the fees from state hospitals, etc. There are other examples, but those are three of the larger ones, okay? So if you really wanted to try and generate more revenue, you could just have the states increase the tuition at all the state universities. I've been told it's pretty affordable now, so that shouldn't cause any real harms, okay? The second area that states get a lot of their funding is maybe less useful for the Counterplan itself, but is an important thing for you to know about in the context of some things that are like actually going on in the world, which is that they get a lot of money from federal transfers, okay? So that sort of harkens back to that graph or that map that I showed you before about the states that receive more money from the federal government than they actually pay to the federal government in taxes, right? The federal government is actually the largest source of money for, well, not, it is a plurality of the money that the states receive. About a third of the money that the states receive according to this graph, which admittedly is like 5 years old, okay? Think of things like Medicaid. That is a large portion of the money that the federal government gives to states. And then also, more recently, the federal government has given the states a large amount of money for COVID spending, okay? And many of you might use examples of cities and municipalities that have passed a UBI as an example that states can indeed do a UBI. And it turns out that most of those municipalities have either private funding or have just taken their COVID stimulus from the federal government and use that to fund their UBIs. They're not really being paid by taxation directly from the states. Rather, most of them are being paid by private donation and federal transfer. Okay? I believe, I'm actually quite confident, that that is my last slide about the differences between state and fed, like spending stuff. Do we have any quick questions before I move on to the next part? Yes?
In the slide you just showed before, it had like a sharp increase in state and federal taxes, and I'm wondering like in 2003 what happened.
A sharp increase in, well, that was just state spending versus debt. Was it the blue line or the orange line that was, what? Oh, well, I'm pretty sure that the sharp rise in debt Well, no, because those were federal tax cuts. I don't know. But I can maybe figure it out. I'll keep thinking on it. Off the top of my head, I don't know. Lovely. Okay. Let's talk about some of the net benefits to the state's counterplan, okay? What are normally the two main net benefits to the state's counterplan? Let's get some raised hands. Yes, Michigan sweatshirt. The politics disad. Very good. Over there. Yes, the federalism disad. The federalism disad and the politics disad. These are probably the two most common net benefits to the state's counterplan. Okay? Now, you obviously can have others, but I'm going to talk about these two specifically for a reason. Okay? I want to start with the federalism disad. So, the federalism disad generally says that the plan would be an example of the government taking control over state authority, which disrupts the balance of power between the federal governments and the states. That is, generally speaking, the thesis of the traditional federalism disadvantage. The states are supposed to be in charge of something now, and that balance between state and federal control is stable. The plan disrupts that control by putting too much authority in the hands of the federal government. That causes states to not be able to use broad sort of like power, which is bad because states are good. Okay? The problem with this disad on this topic is that it is not a disad. Okay? Because the states and the federal government, there is no clash. Like, there's no controversy about who should tax and raise revenue, who has the power to do so. There is no controversy about who has the power to establish something like a jobs guarantee. They both have the authority to do so. Right? Like, that's where we started. Okay? To me, this is actually perhaps a more important argument than you might think. Because as we are about to get into, and this is sort of the start of the discussion that I want to have about theories surrounding the 50 states counterplan, but one of the common arguments that people make is that it is the core topic controversy, or there is a large literature base suggesting that this is a controversy that we should be discussing, and thus we should get education. That is not true. There is not a controversy about who has the authority to do this. The controversy on this year's topic is how we should pay for fiscal redistribution, not who should pay for fiscal redistribution. And just because the 50-state counterplan was very good on the education topic, where this was an actual controversy, or the criminal justice topic, where the vast majority of prisons and the criminal justice system is run by state governments, those were actual federal versus state controversies. This topic isn't. It's just shoehorning in an argument that we want to read because it's easy to fiat stuff, which should dramatically change the way that you debate theory against the state's counterplan on this topic compared to those topics. Now, the politics disad, sort of a different story. The politics disad, the general reason that it operates as a net benefit to the state's counterplan is because if the state governments are the ones who do the action, then it doesn't require any federal expenditure of political capital. It does not disrupt the bipartisan spirit of the Congress. It does not require floor time, whatever you want your link to be, okay? So that sort of distinction, I think, will probably be the more popular net benefit to states on this topic. I think that it will be primarily good because the links on the topic are so good, okay? But I would challenge you all to, when you are affirmative, try and make a robust and persuasive argument about whether or not the way that we read the state's counterplan in debate links to the net benefit, okay? And obviously links to the net benefit arguments are better if you have some evidence, right? And the problem is you aren't going to have evidence. You aren't going to have evidence because the negatives counterplan is not rooted in reality. They may as well be defending philosophical competition, okay? There are not cards that say, if all 50 states were to pass the same policy simultaneously and then create an interstate compact where they share the money so that they can equally distribute it while simultaneously rejecting federal transfers and increasing their revenue streams to record proportions in order to redistribute wealth would disrupt the federal political process. Those cards don't exist because the reality of that counterplan is non-existent, okay? But just imagine for me a second a world where Democratic President Joe Biden is so poor of a legislator that all 50 states, including Alabama and New Hampshire and Utah, with vastly different political philosophies, all agree that we need fiscal redistribution so much that they are going to pass a uniform policy. And the federal government is so incompetent and inefficient, despite the fact that they are led by a Democratic Senate and a Democratic president, that the 50 states have to band together and do it for them. Do you think that that would help President Biden's political capital? Likely not. Okay? Like, there's a pretty good argument that if the federal government is so inefficient at doing what they are doing, that the states have to take it upon themselves to amend all of their constitutions to allow deficit spending, then perhaps it would have political ramifications on the federal government. Maybe. And just wait until like next spring when people are reading the elections dis-ad. I bet Biden's re-election campaign will go really well when all of the states are in the process of amending their constitutions to allow deficit spending because the federal government is so inept. No way that it has an effect on the political process. This is silly. Okay, let's talk about theory then. Okay? Because at the end of the day, there's a large swath of judges that you are not going to be able to convince, no matter how hard you try, that the DA links to the net benefit, or that you can't just fiat your way through these things. But the good part about that is all of those arguments are just more fuel to the fire that perhaps 50-state fiat is not what we should be debating. So first, I would like to make the case for 50-state fiat and for the counterplan. And before we really get into this activity, okay, I want you all to think about debating theory on this year's topic not as a competitive block reading competition from the things that were written in 2017 on the education topic, but rather as a novel debate that we have the opportunity to engage in around a very interesting literature base with both affirmative and negative grounds, okay? And when you are talking about a theory debate, it is important to think about theory debates through the lens of an offense-defense paradigm, because both teams will have interpretations about what should be allowed that will get to serve as sort of a large defensive shield to the other team's offense, and both teams will also have offensive arguments about why their interpretation is good, okay? So generally speaking, the negative, as they defend the state's counterplan, is going to defend uniformity, okay? A uniform 50-state action is generally going to be their defense. Not always. Like in the case of Social Security, you might have to devolve Social Security authority to the states, which is like a whole different thing, and we might not get there because it's already 1041. But Your first sort of defense of why you should be allowed to use uniform 50-state fiat should probably be negative flexibility, okay? And usually when I see people debate neg flex, it sort of just sounds like neg flex, being neg is hard, we should get to do what we want, okay? But you need to have a slightly more in-depth defense of negative flexibility on this year's topic, okay? The affirmative has advantages in debate. This is actually what neg flex, the argument, is making. And when I say advantages, I don't mean like advantage one is inequality, okay? The advantages that I'm talking about that the affirmative has is that they get to give the first and the last speech, and they get to choose the topic of discussion. Those are large advantages strategically that the affirmative has in debate. And in order for the negative team to sort of check back against those strategic advantages in the activity, the logic goes that they should be able to test the affirmative from multiple angles, and they should be able to sort of expansively use their power as the negative with fiat and, you know, whatever else in order to cut back against the structural advantages in debate that the affirmative team has, okay? The other argument that makes neg flex particularly good, although I think maybe less so on this topic than on the last few topics, is that the status quo is usually bad, okay? Now, obviously the status quo, in terms of income inequality, is not good, okay? That is not my defense of why this is maybe less true on this topic. But the problem that we've had on recent topics is that not only is the status quo bad, but there are also not unique disadvantages, okay? And this topic, while the status quo is bad, the negative does have some disads, okay? Which maybe undermines some of this neg flex argument just a little bit. But the general idea is like the negative can just, or the affirmative can just get up and make appeals to how bad the status quo is and say, you know, even if there are some bad things that might happen because of the plan, like we should not be complacent in a world where income inequality runs as rampant as it does right now when there is a perceivable solution, which is a pretty persuasive argument, okay? So maybe we do need negative flexibility. The second argument that people will usually make in defense of the 50-state counterplan is that there is a large literature base discussing state versus federal action. And quite frankly, that is true. They will say things like, this is the core topic controversy that we are supposed to be debating. Because it is the core topic controversy, it encourages us to engage in in-depth research, which helps us gain the educational benefits that we should gain from the activity. If it is the core topic controversy, then it increases our topic education. We have chosen to debate this topic because we believe that it has, you know, timely merit within our society. So sort of like skirting the core of that discussion is not a good idea. And oftentimes, to prove this point, they will read cards. And quite frankly, I think on this year's topic, if people get good at debating 50-state fiat bad on the AF, I think you might need to read some cards on the neg that establishes any of those things as true, right? Because I can stand up here and say, yeah, this is the core topic controversy, but that's just a claim, right? The card is what actually provides the warrant that there is literature defending on, or sort of like debating, who should fund a UBI, or who should do a federal jobs guarantee. There's not really any literature on Social Security, but yeah. Okay? So reading cards there can be very helpful on establishing that that is true. The last argument that people make is that we need a functional limit on the topic. Okay? And this is, well, I shouldn't say last, because there are a bunch of other arguments, but probably the last main argument that people make is that we need a functional limit on the topic. This is a pretty good argument, okay? In modern debate, topics are relatively large. There are a lot of affirmatives that fit under the umbrella of what can be done. There's a lot of flexibility in terms of those affirmatives and what they can do. A lot of those affirmatives, well, I guess the affirmative team with their infinite prep time and their ability to choose the topic of of discussion has a competitive incentive to make their affirmative as small and specific as possible in order to avoid links to disadvantages. And we need a big sort of like wieldy counterplan that allows us to check back against those affirmative advantages. Now, one problem that you sort of have on this topic is that there's another pretty good functional limit, which is picking out of taxes. So you might need to be ready to defend that the tax pick does not actually solve your functional limit concerns. And when you are affirmative, you should say that it does. But generally speaking, that is a debate that you should prepare yourself for. Okay? Now, you also need defense to the affirmative team's offense. So I guess I'm going to preempt a lot of the next slide. Okay? So usually the affirmative will accuse the negative of justifying multi-actor fiat. You should say, no, we aren't multi-actor fiat. We are a uniform action among all 50 states. Like an example like the National Governors Association or something like that that might be able to uniformly enact state policy. Quite frankly, I don't think that the NGA has the authority to amend all 50 state constitutions. In fact, they don't. So your case for not being multi-actor fiat becomes, I feel like, a little bit worse in a world where you have to call, or where you have to like have state constitutional amendments removed in order to allow deficit spending. That probably has to be each, government independently doing things, especially since not all of them even have those amendments. So like, I don't even know how it would work if it was uniform. Not all of them have a debt to GDP ratio cap. Like, this doesn't make any sense, but people are going to say it. So there you go. Okay? You should say, usually, that advocates prove that the research is good and not fabricated. Okay? And you should usually have something approaching an advocate. The affirmative team should call the state's counterplan repetitive and boring because we debate it on every domestic topic and it seems to get worse each year than it was the last. But you should say that the actual literature solves that repetition. Sure, the mechanism of the 50 states taking the action is the same, but the literature about what they take the action on is different, right? Like the last time we debated the state's counterplan was the water topic. I don't really count state partnerships. That doesn't rise to the level of what I would call an argument. But the last time we debated a traditional 50 states counterplan was the water topic, right? So like, yeah, we debated the state's counterplan, but the literature that we read about the states and their ability to implement the plan was different, which means that the research is novel. I mean, come on, everybody knows that. We found all 4 cards on the internet. Okay? And then you should use some historical examples of uniform 50-state action. These aren't very good, but I did my best. Okay? So if you do a deep dive into what are called uniform laws, there are actual examples of organizations that are sort of dedicated to trying to pass uniform law across all 50 states. Not the example I'm using for this slide, but maybe the best example of this is what's called the Uniform Penal Laws, or the Uniform Penal Code, which is sort of a group of organizations attempt to make things like state mandatory minimums, et cetera, uniform across all 50 states. And to be honest, they've been relatively successful. A lot of states have very similar laws, okay? Which is, largely good. You should not like accidentally fall over the border and something that you have done goes from being legal to illegal, because that can be a little bit confusing, particularly if you're not well versed in legal literature. The one that is probably the most successful or is the close to being actually uniformly adopted, is what is called the Uniform Commercial Code. And the Uniform Commercial Code is essentially a set of laws that is designed for, well, to allow interstate commerce in some ways, right? So like you can produce a good in one state, you can store that good in an Amazon warehouse in a different state, and then you can sell that good in a third state and have sales tax applied to it in state 3. And in order to allow all of that to happen without huge problems with the transfer of goods and the different tax systems within the states, et cetera, we have to have a relatively uniform commercial code. And it is relatively uniform. It's pretty much the same everywhere. Another example that people often use is the drinking age. To me, this is maybe not as good of an example because all of the states adopting the same drinking age actually required pretty much federal coercion. Like the federal government had to threaten to withhold transfers to the states, and actually did withhold transfers from some until they changed their drinking age. So like that example is probably, I don't know, maybe more of a links to the net benefit argument than it is a example of like pure 50-state uniformity, because the federal government had to make them do it. But you can make it. Most people won't know that. It'll be fine. All right. The case against the state's counterplan. So, the first argument that you should make, I feel like I have already introduced, which is this is not actually the topic controversy, okay? The topic controversy is how we should fund these things, not who should fund them. And I think Ms. Randall did a really good job of describing this in her politics lecture, right? Like all of these polls, everyone sort of agrees that, you know, or at least like 50% of people seem to think, yeah, we should do all of these things. They're very popular with people. What becomes considerably less popular is how to fund them. Like, this is the actual controversy in the literature, is how we should be funding these. You should say that the 50 states counterplan is multi-actor fiat. It fiats over 50 individual governments. You should then give examples of things that justifies, right? That justifies fiating international organizations, that justifies fiating the alt on the criticism, that justifies fiating all sorts of different things. That is essentially why the comment that I made earlier is that the way that we go for the state's counterplan is almost approaching what Cahern was describing yesterday, which is like philosophical competition. We just fiat a new universe into existence. It's a radical political imaginary, man. Imagine if the states just took over federal control. Okay? So this leads me into whether or not this is a real-world application. Even if the literature exists, and it does, like you all have seen some of the cards. I even think the title of the article for the UBI advocate is like, why states should do it instead of the federal government. I don't know, the card's up here in a minute. But like, these articles exist, but they don't exist in the way that the counterplan says that they should exist, okay? There is not an advocate that says the 50 states should remove their balanced budget agreements and deficit spend in order to fund a UBI. There's not an advocate that says the states should form an interstate compact and distribute taxes equitably in order to fund a UBI. That is the argument that you should be making on the negative. And you should indict their solvency advocates in the actual theory debates. They are going to say, we have a solvency advocate. And you have to be like, no. You have a solvency advocate for like 1/18 of what the counterplan does. Okay? And then the last argument that you should say is that it's sort of like stale and repetitive research. Every domestic topic that we've had, which is 2 out of every 3 years, pretty much, devolves to the state's counterplan and the politics DA, and maybe it's time that we do something different. Okay? And then you need defense. The first argument you should make is that non-uniformity solves. It actually is possible, okay? It actually is possible that all 50 states maybe could pass a UBI. Like, that's possible. I'm not going to lie to you. But they would not look uniform. There's literally no reason that if Mississippi and Washington, D.C. each created their own UBI, that those states would want the UBIs to be exactly the same. They're collecting a massively different percentage of each state's individual income. Those things all make the literature, if the NAG were to just read a non-uniform counterplan, they make the literature much, much, much more real. The problem is they also make answering the counterplan much, much, much easier. So they're never going to do it. Okay? But non-uniformity solves all of their research offense. It solves all of their topic controversy offense. If this actually is the topic controversy, they can still engage in it. They just don't need to engage in it in a uniform manner. Pretty much the only thing that non-uniform doesn't solve is neg flex. So you should say that the negative team has sufficient answers to the affirmative on this topic. There are other functional limits that obviate the strength of neg flex on this topic. First off, the topic is not that big. There is a case list on the topic. As we have established, some of the more precise definitions of that case list imply that 2 of the portions of the topic are pretty small. You have to have a universal jobs guarantee, maybe, and you probably have to have a universal income, right? Like, that's a pretty small topic. The Social Security part, maybe not quite as much, but if you're talking about Social Security when you're talking about the state's counterplan, I don't even know what you're doing, because it can't solve it. Okay? I mean, I guess you could devolve or do all sorts of other things, but the traditional uniform 50-state fiat counterplan can not adjust Social Security, which is a federal program. Okay? And then the second thing is that you have, if you really need a counterplan that badly to solve the idea that the status quo is bad, then you can read the Texas pick. You do not need the state's counterplan on this topic. But the other argument that you should be making, and this is the argument that makes me real, like if you are affirmative, you need to delete the 2AC and 1AR blocks that you have been reading since the education topic. Because on the education topic, the reason that people had a hard time winning 50-state fiat debates is because there wasn't good negative ground. Like, there was not any good negative ground. And then people have just been reading the same arguments since then. Make your arguments specific to this topic. There are disadvantages that link to the affirmative and might have good turns case arguments that allow you to interact with the affirmative. Remember, the core tenet of your argument is that this topic controversy is how things should be funded, not who is going to fund them. And if you center your arguments around that what we should be debating is the method of funding and not where the funding comes from, then this argument becomes much, much, much easier because you have disadvantage to taxes. You have disadvantages to, even if the AF somehow wins, that, the AF can just deficit spend, we definitely also have disadvantages to deficit spending. Like, there are disads on this topic. The politics CA itself is very good on this topic. We'll see if, Congress makes it to where there are politics disads to read, but the links are good. Okay? And then you need to answer their neg flex stuff, which is everything that I was just talking about. And you should say that debate is better when it focuses on germane offense, as opposed to fiat tricks and hand waving. I only have about 9 more minutes, so I was going to pause for questions here, but I'll just pause for those questions after my next 3 slides, which should be relatively quick. Okay? And I'll just pause for all questions then, and hopefully give you all about 10 minutes of questions before break. Am I supposed to be done at 10 or 15? 10? Okay, thank you. Okay, so states and basic income. Okay, so this is actually a card from the Georgetown file, not necessarily from our file. But the general idea is that states can use a combination of taxes or spending of excess revenue in some way in order to fund a basic income. They could also probably borrow from the federal government, at least to the limit that is necessary, or they could remove those limits altogether and just increase state borrowing in order to do this. There are advocates, like this one is literally called Policy at National, State, and Local Levels for UBIs, which is a pretty good sort of indication that there is literature surrounding whether or not those policies should exist at the state or the federal level. Okay? There are obviously examples of UBIs that exist in the world at the state and local level right now. Most of the localities who have UBIs right now are sort of using federal discretionary funds that were given during COVID to fund those. So maybe not the best examples if you're trying to prove that the states can do it alone. But Alaska is a pretty good example of the state doing it on its own. Alaska has this thing called the Alaska Permanent Fund. It is largely funded by oil revenue. Not all states have oil revenue, so maybe they don't have quite the budget surplus that Alaska does. But they have been able to have the first sort of semi-successful example of a UBI at the state level based on that excess revenue that they have accumulated. Okay? So there is some proof of concept that the states can do this. And I honestly think that a lot of the solvency cards for a basic income are maybe the best for states because of all those examples. Okay? The next section is a federal jobs guarantee. You will notice that I wrote states and job guarantee because, the states probably can't do a federal job guarantee, although the way that you all write your counterplans, they may as well, since they would just become the federal government. But again, they would need to tax and borrow in order to fund this job guarantee. They could offer jobs with the state government. And the advocates for this one are maybe not as good that I have seen. So most of you have noticed that in the state's counterplan starter file for us, the advocate is pretty specific that it's just like a half-time job guarantee, which is slightly different, allows the affirmative to generate some solvency deficits. This is the solvency advocate from the Georgetown starter pack. It is a little bit, I guess, more in-depth that it could be like a full jobs guarantee. Unfortunately, the card itself, not very good. Says all sorts of things like it would have to rely on a little bit of federal funding. Also, it's from a not very qualified author. I think it's from somebody with an undergraduate degree in political science writing on Medium. And it gives such excellent examples of a jobs guarantee as a beautifier and security guards. That's what we will do for our state jobs guarantee, according to this advocate. Okay? So these ones are probably not as in-depth in terms of the literature, at least the literature that I have found so far. Okay? Last, states and Social Security. We sort of have a problem here. I do not have a card. That is mostly because Social Security is a federal program. States probably cannot expand Social Security. If they did, it would probably get preempted by the federal government. Federal preemption is basically the federal government striking down a state action because it violates the federal government's express authority. Since this is a independently federal program that does not share any sort of concurrent state power or state funding or anything else, the federal government would very likely not be happy if all 50 states tried to change the age limit for Social Security. I don't think that they would allow that. Okay? Now, that is not to say that people will not read the state's counterplan. You could just read a state advantage counterplan that has a whole bunch of different planks that are designed to solve the affirmative team's impacts and just say, have the state government do all of that stuff. Whatever the states would do, like I think we've discussed when doing like the overview of Social Security, how this might have, like the Social Security section of the topic might have some pretty repetitive advantages, et cetera, et cetera. So like, you know, you could just design a state's counterplan that would solve those advantages, whether it's an inequality advantage or whatever else, and then, you know, read a disadvantage to Social Security. The politics links to Social Security are very good. So this is, you know, a pretty reasonable strategy for the negative. But it would still, you know, be one that you could have concern with as an affirmative team, either from a theoretical perspective or from a funding perspective. I'm skipping my next slide. Questions? Danny.
Why, and like, from an app perspective, how would you justify 50 states fiat being a voter, or should you?
So the question was, how should you justify 50 state fiat being a voter, or should you? The answer is, I mean, the only real justification that I can think of off the top of my head is just like deterrence. Early in the season, we can establish that the topic controversy should be something else and discourage people from reading this argument. But like ultimately, it feels like it doesn't really have to be a voter because rejecting the argument will probably result in you winning the debate if you are any good at debating your AF. Because like the whole point of the way that people fiat through all the solvency deficits on the state's counterplan is that they don't want to debate the AF very much. So if you get the judge to reject the counterplan itself, you can usually win that the counterplan outweighs whatever the net benefit is, or sorry, the plan outweighs whatever the net benefit is. Yeah, over here. Yes, yes. No, you should obviously read the state's counterplan as the negative, okay? The state's counterplan is a good argument that is difficult to answer, okay? I've sat through some of these lectures now, and I came to the conclusion from sitting through those lectures that a lot of what you all have been hearing is that the state's counterplan is unanswerable. And I don't want you to leave this camp thinking that there is not an answer to the state's counterplan. Because one of the things that makes debate cool is that there are answers to arguments. Like every argument has an answer. It is not just fiat whatever you want and GG, the judge votes neg. Okay? This is not a thing. The AF can answer these arguments, and the AF should answer these arguments. The neg should also read the counterplan, because it is not particularly easy to answer, right? Like I've been thinking about constructing this lecture for like 3 weeks now. I've had plenty of time to think about how I would answer a state's counterplan. Most people in the country have not just like sat around like nerds and thought about this, either theoretically or substantively. So you'll probably be fine reading it on the neg. I would tell you to read it. Because, like I said to Danny, like, the number of debates that you're going to lose for having it in your 1NC, very small. Yes, I mean, each individual state would have to do the counterplan, especially if you're doing things like modifying the state constitutions. Those would have to be individual state actions. I think the general idea is that it happens uniformly, or it happens in conjunction with each other, which basically means that just like fiating the federal government is fiating, congressional passage of deficit spending and the president signing it, and, it holding up to any Supreme Court tests, right? Like, everything is multi-actor, is one of the arguments that you should probably make to defend that. And if it is a uniform action, then you should think about it uniformly. Does that make sense? Cool. Yeah.
Are permutations like more strategic? Because we talked about like how there are taxes that are implemented kind of.
So, yeah, you're fine. Yes, permutations. So, like, I probably should have spent some time talking about like the perm shielding the link to politics, or even the way that a permutation would interact if someone were to do something like federalism. But I think that the sort of like explanation of either the action is so like out of the ordinary, or like a bolt from the blue, that it would cause political ramifications, or the action is so popular that no one would care, and thus doing both would probably not cause any political ramifications because everyone would be so, enamored with their new UBI, is like a winnable way of framing like a perm shields the link argument. But I think that like, the opposite part of saying like increasing taxes would obviously lead to, social unrest in the states that would spill over to the federal government. Like, I almost think that the links to the net benefit argument is maybe a little bit better than the perm shields the link argument, personally. Eric. Maybe. I mean, I've not seen any interstate compact. I'm going to be honest, I didn't really start thinking about the interstate compact part of this counterplan until like yesterday, when I started really delving into like the per capita medium income, the per capita income of people in states. So, I mean, I do think that if people start really researching those deficits and making those arguments, probably the next logical reaction by the negative will be things like interstate compacts, but I haven't gotten enough into that literature base yet to know how good the literature is for the neg. I'm just being honest. They don't. Fed transfers money to states. Okay, I have time for, well, it's 11:15. If you want to ask me questions, come up here and ask me questions, otherwise I'm done.